It was a cold, bleak winter afternoon when Tim found himself hiking through a growing snowstorm in the mountains. The wind howled, biting at his exposed skin, and the snow was coming down hard, blanketing the world in a thick, icy sheet. Tim had been hiking these trails for years, an avid lover of nature, always seeking the peace and beauty of the wild. Today, though, the weather felt different. There was a heaviness in the air, and the blizzard was relentless. Visibility had dropped sharply, the storm obscuring everything more than a few feet ahead. As Tim pushed forward, his boots sinking deeper into the snow, the usual tranquility of his hikes was replaced with a sense of urgency. The wind seemed to scream through the trees, and the snow whipped around him in every direction, turning the forest into an indistinct blur of white. Tim knew he had to hurry. The trail was familiar, but with the storm worsening, he knew the conditions could turn dangerous quickly. His instincts told him to turn back, but the small part of him that longed for adventure pushed him onward. That was when he saw it. Just ahead, barely visible through the thick curtain of snow, a small, shadowy figure appeared. Tim paused, squinting into the storm. At first he thought it might be a trick of the snow, perhaps a trickling branch or a patch of shadow cast by the trees. But as he moved closer, the figure became clearer. It wasn't a trick of the mind or the storm. It was a tiny creature, crouched low to the ground, barely able to stay steady in the harsh winds. As Tim approached, his heart skipped a beat. It was a bobcat kitten, small and vulnerable, its fur matted with snow and its eyes wide with fear. The kitten's little body trembled as it looked up at Tim, its wide amber eyes reflecting the storm's fury. For a moment, Tim simply stood there, unsure of what to do. Bobcats were elusive animals, rarely seen by humans, and certainly not in conditions like these. The sight of the tiny, defenseless creature was both startling and heartbreaking. Tim took a careful step forward, not wanting to startle the kitten. The storm made everything feel surreal, and he couldn't help but feel an odd connection to the little animal. It was as though the bobcat, despite its wild instincts, was somehow asking for help. It looked at Tim with what seemed like desperation in its eyes, its tiny paws unable to find purchase on the icy ground. He knew he had to act quickly. The snowstorm was worsening by the minute, and the temperatures were dangerously low. Bobcats, though tough, weren't meant to survive in these kinds of conditions alone, especially a kitten this young. Tim's heart went out to the animal. He could see the fear in its eyes, and for a brief moment, the world around him seemed to fade into the background. It was just him and the kitten, caught in the middle of a raging storm. The little bobcat didn't run away. Instead, it took a few tentative steps toward Tim, its body stiff with cold. For some reason, it seemed to trust him. The creature's instinct would usually be to stay hidden and avoid human contact, but not now. It was as if it had chosen him, as though it knew Tim might be its only chance for survival in the brutal storm. Tim couldn't understand why, but the kitten was following him now, its tiny steps echoing in the soft, heavy snow. With a pang of concern, Tim realized that the storm wasn't letting up. If the kitten was going to make it, it couldn't stay out here much longer. Despite his own exhaustion and the worsening conditions, he began walking again. The little bobcat following closely behind. Each step he took, the kitten took another. It wasn't running, nor was it straying away. It was simply following him, its fragile body determined to stay close, to trust. Tim's mind raced. What should he do? The idea of leaving the kitten behind wasn't an option, yet he knew that heading back into the woods could be dangerous. He couldn't stop thinking about the tiny animal's fate, knowing that the snowstorm was only going to get worse. So, Tim pressed on, determined to find shelter for them both, though he had no idea how long the journey would take, or what obstacles lay ahead in the snowstorm. The little Bobcat Kitten followed Tim closely, its tiny steps leaving delicate prints in the deepening snow. Despite the ferocity of the storm, it never faltered, its determination to stay with him growing stronger with each passing step. Tim couldn't help but marvel at the resilience of the small creature, though he knew that the kitten was struggling. It had been caught in the storm, and its body, so fragile and unprepared for such harsh conditions, was clearly weakening. Tim's heart ached as he watched the kitten's tiny paws struggle to keep up with him, leaving an occasional wisp of snow as it stumbled over uneven ground. With every step Tim took, the wind howled even louder, whipping snowflakes into his face, making it harder to see the path ahead. The world seemed swallowed by the storm, and the only thing he could focus on was the little Bobcat Kitten trailing behind him. Tim's instincts told him to hurry, but he knew he had to be careful not to outpace the kitten. He glanced back frequently, making sure it was still there, trying to gauge how much further it could go. There was something about the kitten's presence that was both heartbreaking and endearing. Despite the storm's fury, it continued to follow Tim without hesitation, never straying from his side. The way it kept looking up at him, its wide eyes filled with a kind of quiet desperation, struck a chord deep within him. The kitten wasn't just following, it was relying on him, almost as though it knew that Tim was its only hope in this wild, unforgiving world. Tim's mind raced with thoughts of what to do. The storm was relentless, and he couldn't help but wonder how long the kitten had been out here before they crossed paths. Could it have been abandoned? Or had it simply wandered too far from its den, unable to find shelter? It was hard to imagine that such a tiny creature could survive in such extreme conditions, but somehow it had, and now it was counting on him to get it to safety. The deeper they ventured into the snow, the more Tim realized that this was no ordinary encounter. He wasn't just walking with a stray animal. He was in the midst of something raw, something that spoke to the very core of nature's fragility. The Bobcat Kitten wasn't meant to be here, exposed and vulnerable to the storm, and yet it had found him, trusting him in a way that Tim had never expected. Tim tried to quicken his pace, but the snow was thick and treacherous, slowing him down with every step. The deep snow made it hard to move, and he could feel his legs burning from the exertion. Every time he looked back, the kitten was still there, but now it was moving more slowly. Its small body was visibly fatigued, its breath coming in shallow bursts. Tim could see that the cold was taking its toll, and his concern grew with each passing moment. The kitten stumbled again, its legs buckling under the weight of exhaustion. Tim stopped immediately and looked back at it, his heart tightening in his chest. The bobcat wasn't giving up. It was still trying to follow, despite its weakness. Tim could see the effort it took to take each step, its little body trembling as it struggled to stay on its feet. Without thinking, Tim knelt down, trying to assess the situation. The snowstorm was only intensifying, and the kitten's fragile state made it clear that it couldn't keep going much longer. There wasn't much time. He knew that if he didn't act soon, the kitten might not survive the cold and the storm. For a brief moment, Tim hesitated. He was deep in the wilderness, miles from any kind of shelter. The storm was fierce, and the path ahead was uncertain. He had no idea how far the nearest cabin was, or if he could even make it there in time. But then he looked down at the little bobcat, its eyes still locked onto his, filled with a mixture of trust and vulnerability. That look sealed the decision for him. Tim knew he couldn't leave the kitten to face the storm alone. He gently scooped the tiny creature into his arms, holding it close to his chest to shield it from the biting wind. The kitten was light, almost weightless, but its cold body was stiff and trembling. As he cradled it, Tim could feel its rapid heartbeat, a stark reminder of just how fragile it was. He tightened his grip, careful not to hurt it, and began to move forward, his steps slower now, mindful of the small, precious life he was carrying. The snow continued to fall in sheets, the storm showing no signs of relenting, but Tim pressed on. With the bobcat nestled against him, he knew he couldn't stop, not yet. The storm had made everything more difficult, but the urgency of the situation was clear. If he was going to get both of them out of here safely, he had to keep going, no matter how hard the journey became. The snowstorm continued to rage around Tim as he trudged forward, the weight of the little bobcat kitten still nestled tightly against his chest. Each step was becoming harder. The wind whipped in unpredictable gusts, blasting ice-cold snow into his face, making it nearly impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. The trail that Tim had once known so well was now barely recognizable, lost in the blinding white chaos of the storm. The trees around him, usually towering and solid, now seemed ghostly figures in the mist, their branches swaying wildly, bent by the fury of the storm. Tim could feel the weight of the kitten pressing against him, a constant reminder of the fragile life he was trying to protect. Despite its size, the kitten had taken on a heavier significance to him, almost as though it had become a part of him in those few short hours of their journey together. He wasn't just carrying an animal. He was carrying a responsibility, one that was growing with every mile they covered. Every now and then Tim would glance down at the little creature, hoping to see it clinging to him, trusting him as it had from the very beginning. But as the journey wore on, he noticed that the kitten was no longer as alert. Its tiny head rested heavily against his chest, its body limp from exhaustion. The cold had seeped deep into its bones, and its small body was beginning to feel stiff in his arms. Tim could feel the tension building in his chest as he realized that time was running out. The kitten wasn't just tired, it was dangerously close to shutting down. Tim's mind raced as he pushed on, trying to focus on getting to safety. He had been hoping for a break in the storm, for some sign that the worst was over, but it never came. The snow fell harder, and the wind seemed to have a life of its own, howling louder with every step. The ground underfoot was treacherous, thick with snow and ice, making it difficult to maintain his footing. Tim's legs burned with the effort, but he couldn't stop. He couldn't afford to. Every minute he hesitated was another minute the kitten was exposed to the elements. Another minute it could be slipping closer to unconsciousness. The distance felt like it was growing between him and the world around him. The path he once knew so well had disappeared beneath the storm, and the vast wilderness seemed both endless and suffocating. He glanced over his shoulder, but the storm obscured any trace of the trail behind him. The only thing that mattered now was getting to shelter, anything to protect the tiny bobcat in his arms. Tim stumbled, his foot slipping on a patch of ice, but he regained his balance quickly, continuing his pace, now more cautiously. He felt the kitten's head press further into his chest, as if it were trying to find warmth. There was something almost heart-wrenching in the way it had become so still, so silent. Tim wished he could do more, carry it faster, find shelter sooner, but he was running out of options. The cabin was still miles away, and he knew that they couldn't keep up this pace for long. As the hours passed, Tim's energy began to wane. He could feel his own exhaustion creeping in, but he refused to stop. Every time he thought of pausing, his mind was filled with the image of the Bobcat Kitten growing weaker in his arms. It wasn't just the cold. It was the helplessness he felt, knowing he was doing all he could, yet it might not be enough. He had no idea if the kitten could make it another mile, let alone the remaining distance to the cabin. He tried to shake off the nagging fear that had started to take root in his chest. The bobcat body was growing colder, its tiny limbs stiffer. Tim's breath came in labored gasps, the air growing thicker as the storm closed in on them. The world felt like it was becoming smaller, more distant. The only thing that anchored Tim was the warmth of the small body still pressed to his chest. It wasn't just his physical warmth that the kitten sought. It was his presence, the only steady thing in a world that was falling apart around them. As he pushed on, Tim's thoughts wandered back to his own safety. The storm had already delayed him for hours, and while he was an experienced hiker, the conditions were becoming perilous. But that didn't matter. There was no turning back now. The kitten had chosen him, had followed him through the storm, and Tim wouldn't let it down. His only focus was getting to shelter, to warmth, to safety. With each step, he couldn't help but wonder if they could make it in time. The storm was relentless, but so was the little bobcat that continued to trust him, even when its strength seemed to be failing. Tim's heart ached as he felt the weight of the responsibility. He couldn't fail now, not when the kitten needed him most. Tim's legs were on fire as he pushed through the deepening snow, the weight of the little bobcat still pressing against his chest. The storm raged on with relentless fury, the wind howling like an untamed beast, whipping snow into his face with unforgiving force. He had long since lost track of how many miles he had covered, but the world around him had turned into a dizzying blur of white. The trail that had once felt familiar was now a maze of drifts and icy paths, and every step felt heavier than the last. The Bobcat Kitten, once so determined and alert, had grown weaker with each passing moment. Tim could feel the small body growing colder, stiffer in his arms, and despite his best efforts to shield it from the worst of the storm, he knew the kitten was fading. It was no longer trying to stay awake or alert. It had grown almost lifeless, the warmth it had once sought, now almost completely gone. Tim's heart pounded with a mix of fear and determination, but he also felt something else, something deeper, the crushing weight of responsibility. He could sense that time was running out, and if he didn't get to shelter soon, the kitten's chances of survival would plummet. It wasn't just the cold that was overwhelming the tiny creature. It was exhaustion. It had been fighting the elements longer than Tim had, and its little body, so fragile and unprepared for such extreme conditions, was succumbing to the storm's brutal grip. Tim's breath came in ragged gasps as he quickened his pace, knowing that he couldn't afford to waste another second. The shelter, the cabin, it had to be close now. The thought of it kept him moving, each step a desperate attempt to hold on to hope, even as the blizzard continued to claw at him, erasing all traces of the world around them. Tim glanced down at the kitten. It was still with him, but barely. Its head had slumped against his chest, its body limp, its breath shallow. His fingers ached from the cold as he adjusted his grip, cradling the bobcat closer in a final attempt to warm it. He wasn't sure how much longer he could keep moving like this. The storm was closing in on them, and he was starting to feel its toll on his own body. His clothes were soaked through, his hands numb, his legs aching with the strain. The snow was deeper now, and every step felt like wading through a sea of frozen sand. Tim stopped for a moment, his chest heaving as he tried to gather his thoughts. The cabin was still ahead. He reminded himself. It was close. The fire inside it, the warmth. It was a beacon of hope, a promise of safety. But the wind was starting to howl louder, and the snow was falling in thick sheets. He couldn't afford to stop for long. If he hesitated, even for a moment, he might lose the precious warmth of the small life that had come to depend on him. His mind raced as he weighed his options. He could push forward, but the storm showed no signs of letting up, and the landscape was becoming increasingly treacherous. He had no idea if the cabin was a mile away or 5 miles away. It was impossible to tell in the whiteout. And then there was the kitten. Its small body was still, so still. Tim's heart skipped a beat as a wave of panic washed over him. The kitten had been so brave, so determined to follow him, but now it seemed to have lost all its strength. Was it too late? With a sense of urgency, Tim pressed on. He couldn't stop now. The cabin had to be close. He had to believe that. As he continued to trudge through the snow, his eyes scanned the horizon, but all he could see was the storm's icy embrace. For a fleeting moment, doubt crept in. What if the cabin wasn't nearby? What if they didn't make it? Tim's chest tightened, but he refused to let those thoughts take root. He would keep going. He had to, for the kitten. It wasn't just a matter of survival anymore. It was a promise. The kitten had placed its trust in him, and he would honor that trust no matter what. With each labored step, he clung to the thought of the fire inside the cabin, to the warmth that awaited them. Tim could feel his legs trembling with exhaustion, his body screaming for rest, but he pushed through, driven by something greater than fatigue, by the will to protect the tiny life in his arms. In the midst of the storm's fury, Tim pushed forward with all the strength he had left. The cabin, the warmth, and the promise of shelter kept him going, one step after another. The storm seemed to grow even fiercer, but Tim didn't stop. He couldn't. The life of the little Bobcat Kitten depended on him, and so he kept moving through the snow, through the storm, with nothing but his determination and the warmth of the small creature still clinging to him for hope. The storm had become unbearable, but Tim's resolve had only strengthened. His body was exhausted, numb from the biting cold, and his breath came in ragged bursts, the icy air burning his lungs. But as the wind screamed around him, Tim focused solely on the little Bobcat Kitten in his arms. Every step forward felt like an eternity, each one deeper into the snow, as the storm continued to lash at them. The world outside had become a blank canvas, just shades of white and gray. He could hardly feel his feet anymore. His legs were stiff, and his mind was starting to play tricks on him. But the kitten's small, fragile form kept him grounded. The closer he got, the more his heart pounded. The cabin had to be near. He had to believe it was. Tim didn't know how much longer he could hold on to his own strength, but there was one thing he was sure of. He couldn't stop now. The kitten had trusted him, had clung to him through this madness, and he couldn't fail it now. He stumbled again, his foot catching on a hidden root beneath the snow, and for a moment he was sure his legs would give out. But just as quickly, Tim regained his balance, pushing himself upright and continuing forward, the urgency growing inside him with each second. The storm had taken everything from him, his warmth, his strength, his clarity, but it hadn't taken his will. He would keep moving. There was no choice. Suddenly, through the wall of snow and howling wind, Tim saw a faint silhouette ahead. His heart leapt in his chest. The shape was hazy, but there was no mistaking it. The outline of a structure stood through the storm, and with each step it grew clearer. It was the cabin. Tim's breath hitched as he quickened his pace, every inch of his being pushing toward the shelter he had been hoping for. His feet slipped in the snow, but he barely noticed as he focused on the cabin in front of him, the warmth and safety it promised. As he neared the cabin, Tim could feel the wind start to lose its bite. The storm, though still strong, seemed to lose some of its ferocity, as if the structure ahead was protecting them. He stumbled the last few feet to the door, his hands shaking as he reached for the handle. With a final burst of energy, Tim forced the door open, the warmth inside almost overwhelming after the biting cold outside. The heat rushed over him, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he could feel his body beginning to thaw, the cold melting away from his skin. Inside the cabin was a small refuge, humble but welcoming. Tim didn't waste any time. He set the little Bobcat Kitten down gently on a rug in front of the fire. The warmth of the flame seemed to bring the smallest sense of life back into the kitten. Its breathing was still shallow, and its body was cold, but Tim could feel the faintest stir. He quickly pulled off his wet clothes, wrapping the kitten in a blanket he found nearby and huddling it close to the fire, hoping the warmth would bring it back to life. Tim's hands were shaking with exhaustion, but he didn't care. He focused entirely on the kitten, rubbing its small body to try and revive some of its warmth. He could feel the tiniest hint of hope stirring inside him as the kitten began to twitch, its muscles responding to the warmth. The fire crackled softly in the background as Tim continued to press warmth into the kitten's body, his eyes never leaving the small creature. The storm still raged outside, but for now they were safe. They had made it. Tim's heart finally slowed as he realized that despite everything, despite the storm, despite the cold, despite the uncertainty, the little bobcat kitten had made it. They had both made it. As the hours passed and the storm began to subside, Tim continued to watch over the kitten, his exhaustion slowly catching up to him. The fire's warmth filled the small cabin, and the kitten began to stir more actively, its eyes fluttering open, a weak but unmistakable sign of life. Tim's relief was overwhelming. The bobcat wasn't out of danger yet, but the worst was over. It had made it through the storm. Tim sat back, his body aching with fatigue, but his heart full of gratitude. Against all odds, they had survived the snowstorm. He had kept his promise. The little bobcat kitten, once lost in the storm, was now safe, nestled in warmth, with a second chance at life. The storm outside had lost its power, and Tim realized with a quiet sense of peace that it had been more than just a test of endurance. It had been a reminder of the strength of trust, and how, even in the harshest of conditions, there is always hope.